In tonight's mystery, we present the lead masks case. Brazil, 1966. 2 bodies found on a hillside wearing lead masks with no signs of trauma and a cryptic note beside them. What really happened on that hill? It's one of those stories that leaves more questions than answers. And tonight, you'll hear it all. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel if this content helps you out. Also, please let us know where you're watching from and what time it is for you. Now, lie back, listen closely, and drift off as the mystery unfolds. The afternoon heat of August 20th, 1966 pressed down on the Vintem Hill like a suffocating blanket. 18-year-old Jorge da Costa Alves had come to the remote area outside Rio de Janeiro, hoping to catch a few birds, a simple weekend pursuit that would forever alter his understanding of the world's mysteries. As he climbed the rocky outcropping, roughly 35 kilometers from the bustling city centre, Jorge expected nothing more than the familiar sounds of nature and perhaps a successful hunt. What he discovered instead would haunt Brazilian investigators for decades and spawn countless theories ranging from the plausible to the utterly bizarre. There, lying side by side in a small clearing near the summit, were 2 men in business suits. At first glance, Jorge assumed he'd stumbled upon a tragic accident, or perhaps the aftermath of violence. But as he approached cautiously, the scene revealed details that defied easy explanation. Both men appeared to be in their 40s, well dressed in dark suits despite the remote location. Each wore identical lead masks, crude, handmade eye coverings that seemed more suited to a welder's workshop than a hiking expedition. The masks weren't commercial products, but rather makeshift constructions, fashioned from thin sheets of lead with rough eye holes cut out. Their positioning was eerily deliberate, lying flat on their backs, arms at their sides, as if they had arranged themselves for some unknown ritual. Beside the bodies, Jorge noticed a small piece of paper, carefully folded and placed where it couldn't be missed. The handwriting was neat, deliberate. 1630, be at agreed place. 1830, swallow capsules. After effect, protect metals. Await signal mask. The cryptic message raised more questions than it answered, written in Portuguese but with an oddly formal tone that suggested either careful planning or perhaps translation from another language. The police arrived within hours of Jorge's panicked report, but the scene they encountered challenged every investigative protocol they knew. Detective Inspector Wilson Pedrosa, a 20-year veteran of Rio's police force, had seen countless crime scenes, but this one felt different from the moment he crested the hill. The formal arrangement of the bodies, the identical masks, the mysterious note, everything suggested a level of organization that contradicted the remote, seemingly random location. Initial examination revealed no obvious signs of violence. There were no bullet wounds, stab marks, or signs of a struggle. The men's clothing was neat and undisturbed, their wallets intact with identification that would soon lead investigators into an even deeper puzzle. Manuel Pereira da Cruz, 32, was an electronic technician from Campos dos Goitacazes. Miguel José Viana, 34, worked as an engineer in the same region, roughly 300 kilometers north of Rio. Tracing the final movements of Manuel Pereira da Cruz and Miguel José Viana proved as perplexing as the discovery itself. The investigation into their last known activities revealed a carefully orchestrated journey that began 3 days before their bodies were found on Vintem Hill. What emerged was a pattern of deliberate misdirection and secretive behaviour that suggested the 2 men were involved in something far more complex than their families had imagined. On August 17th, both men had told their wives they were travelling to São Paulo on business, a plausible explanation given their technical professions and the frequent need for specialists to consult on projects in Brazil's industrial centre. Manuel had even specified he would be examining electronic equipment for a potential client, while Miguel mentioned consulting on an engineering project. Their families had no reason to doubt these explanations, as both men occasionally travelled for work. However, investigators quickly discovered that neither man had any scheduled business in São Paulo. Their employers confirmed no work-related travel had been authorised, and no clients in São Paulo had requested their services. The business trip was an elaborate fiction, constructed to provide cover for their actual destination and purpose. Railway records showed the two men had indeed travelled together, but not to São Paulo. They had purchased tickets to Niterói, just across Guanabara Bay from Rio de Janeiro. Station attendants remembered them partly because of their formal business attire, unusual for tourists visiting the coastal region. They had carried a small suitcase between them and appeared to be consulting notes or documents during the journey. In Niterói, the trail became more complex. Hotel registrations showed they had checked into separate accommodations despite travelling together, another unusual detail that suggested either caution or perhaps instructions from an unknown third party. The hotel clerk at Manuel's lodging recalled the guest asking specific questions about local electronics shops, particularly those that might sell specialised components or materials. This inquiry led investigators to a small electronics supplier where both men had visited on August 18th. The shop owner, Carlos Mendes, remembered them clearly because of their unusual request. They had purchased several items that seemed unrelated to conventional electronics work, sheets of thin lead, basic tools for metalworking, and what Mendes described as materials for making something, not repairing something. When asked about their project, Miguel had mentioned they were constructing protective equipment for an experiment involving electromagnetic fields. The shop owner found this explanation vague but not entirely implausible, given the increasing interest in radio technology and electronic communications. Both men seemed knowledgeable about electronics, asking informed questions about conductivity and shielding properties. More intriguing was their inquiry about local geography. They had asked Carlos Mendes about elevated areas around Niterói and Rio, specifically locations that might offer clear sight lines and minimal interference from urban electrical systems. Mendes had mentioned several possibilities, including Vintém Hill, describing it as isolated but accessible for those willing to hike. The evening of August 18th marked the last confirmed sighting of both men alive. They had dined separately at their respective hotels, but both had asked their desk clerks about transportation to remote areas. Manuel had specifically inquired about reaching locations away from city lights and electrical interference. Miguel had asked about areas suitable for observational activities. Both men had paid their hotel bills in advance for 3 nights, despite checking out after only 2. This suggested they had planned to return, contradicting theories that they had travelled to Rio with suicidal intentions. Their behaviour indicated expectation of survival and return to their normal lives. Reconstruction of their final day revealed careful preparation. On the morning of August 19th, they had purchased supplies including water, basic food, and what appeared to be small glass vials from a pharmacy. The pharmacist remembered Miguel asking about storage of light-sensitive materials, requesting dark glass containers that would protect contents from sunlight. Most puzzling was a conversation overheard by another hotel guest. Through thin walls, the guest had heard one of the men, he couldn't determine which, speaking quietly but urgently into a telephone. The fragments he remembered were tantalizing, references to confirmation of coordinates, weather conditions favourable, and proceeding as discussed. The phone records from both hotels showed no outgoing calls charged to either room, suggesting they had used public phones or had been called by someone else. This detail pointed to coordination with outside parties, individuals who remained completely unknown to investigators. Their journey from Niterói to Vintém Hill on August 19th left no clear trail. No taxi drivers came forward, no bus conductors remembered them. Somehow, 2 men in business suits carrying a suitcase and wearing homemade lead masks had reached one of the most isolated spots in the Rio metropolitan area, without leaving witnesses or evidence of their transportation method. The final piece of their journey remained as mysterious as their ultimate purpose on that desolate hilltop. Inspector Wilson Pedrosa had investigated hundreds of deaths during his career, but the lead mask's case challenged every investigative instinct he'd developed. As the initial findings rolled in from the forensic team, each piece of evidence seemed to deepen the mystery rather than illuminate it. The autopsy results, when they finally arrived, raised more questions about the nature of the 2 men's deaths and the circumstances that had brought them to Vintém Hill. The medical examiner, Dr. Antonio Rodriguez, was a methodical professional who rarely expressed puzzlement about his findings, but the condition of Manuel and Miguel's bodies presented several anomalies that defied easy medical explanation. First, despite the August heat and exposure, The bodies showed remarkably little decomposition. These features suggested either a very recent death or exposure to conditions that had somehow preserved the remains. What was even more perplexing was the complete absence of an obvious cause of death. Preliminary toxicology screens revealed no signs of trauma, wounds, or poisoning. Both men appeared to have simply stopped living, as if some internal switch had been turned off. Their faces, visible beneath the lead masks, showed no expression of pain or distress. If anything, they looked peaceful, almost serene. The toxicology results, however, would take weeks to complete, and Dr. Rodriguez warned that detecting certain substances, particularly exotic compounds or drugs not commonly seen in Brazil, might prove difficult with 1966 laboratory capabilities. He had collected extensive tissue samples, hoping that more sophisticated analysis might eventually reveal what had caused two apparently healthy men to die simultaneously. Meanwhile, Inspector Pedrosa focused on the physical evidence found at the scene. The lead masks themselves were clearly homemade, but their construction showed surprising sophistication. Someone with metalworking knowledge had carefully shaped the lead sheets to fit human faces, creating eye holes positioned precisely for normal vision. The quality suggested either practice in such construction or perhaps guidance from someone with relevant expertise. The mysterious note continued to baffle investigators. Handwriting analysis confirmed it was written by Miguel José Viana, but the formal language and specific terminology seemed uncharacteristic of his usual writing style, based on samples obtained from his employer and family. The phrase, "after effect protect metals awaits signal mask," particularly puzzled linguistic experts consulted by the police. The reference to capsules mentioned in the note became more significant when investigators discovered the small glass vials purchased from the Niterói pharmacy. Investigators found these empty capsules near the bodies, carefully placing them beside the mysterious note. Whatever the capsules had contained was gone, either consumed as the note suggested, or removed by unknown parties before the bodies were discovered. Inspector Pedrosa also grappled with the question of timing. The note specified activities at 1630 and 1830, but determining when these events had actually occurred proved impossible. Weather conditions, decomposition rates, and witness statements provided only rough estimates. The men could have died on August 19th as suggested, or perhaps even earlier, complicating efforts to establish a timeline. The investigation expanded to include interviews with family members, colleagues, and friends of both victims. These conversations revealed that both Manuel and Miguel had been acting somewhat unusually in the weeks before their deaths. Colleagues described them as distracted, occasionally discussing topics outside their normal professional interests. Investigators observed both Manuel and Miguel reading materials about electronics and radio technology, albeit in contexts that appeared more theoretical than practical. Manuel's wife mentioned that he had been receiving mail from unknown correspondents, letters that he would read privately and then carefully store away. However, investigators could not find these letters when they searched his home. Either Manuel had destroyed them, or someone had removed them after his departure for what his family believed was a business trip to São Paulo. Miguel's behaviour had been equally puzzling to those who knew him well. His supervisor at work remembered him asking questions about electromagnetic interference and its effects on human physiology, topics that had no connection to his normal engineering responsibilities. He had also inquired about obtaining materials for experimental work, though he never specified the nature of these experiments. Both men had apparently developed an interest in what one colleague described as invisible forces, electromagnetic fields, radio waves, and atmospheric phenomena that couldn't be seen but could potentially affect human health or consciousness. This interest seemed to have emerged suddenly, over the course of just a few months before their deaths. The investigation also revealed that neither man had any known connection to occult practices, religious extremism, or political activities that might explain their presence on Vintém Hill. They were ordinary technical professionals who had somehow become involved in extraordinary circumstances that cost them their lives. As weeks passed, Inspector Pedrosa found himself with more questions than answers, facing a case that seemed to resist conventional investigative approaches. Theories about the events on Vintém Hill proliferated rapidly as news of the lead masks case spread throughout Brazil and eventually internationally. Inspector Pedrosa found himself fielding calls from journalists, amateur investigators, and self-proclaimed experts, each offering explanations that range from the scientifically plausible to the utterly fantastic. Every conceivable theory about the two men's deaths flourished due to the lack of concrete evidence and the mysterious circumstances surrounding their deaths. The most conventional theory focused on suicide, suggesting that Manuel and Miguel had entered into some form of death pact. Proponents of this explanation pointed to the careful planning evident in their journey, the deliberate positioning of their bodies, and the formal tone of the note as evidence of premeditated self-destruction. However, this theory struggled to explain the lead masks, the reference to awaiting a signal, or the technical language about protecting metals. Dr. Helena Santos, a psychiatrist consulted by the police, offered a more nuanced psychological perspective. She suggested the men might have been suffering from shared delusional disorder, a rare condition where closely associated individuals develop similar false beliefs. In this scenario, both men might have become convinced they needed protection from some imaginary threat, hence the lead masks, and had taken substances they believed would help them survive some perceived danger. The toxicology angle attracted significant attention from medical professionals. Dr. Rodriguez eventually confirmed the presence of digitalis in both bodies, a compound derived from foxglove plants that affects heart rhythm. However, the levels detected were not necessarily fatal, and digitalis had legitimate medical uses that either man might have had access to. Whether the substance represented the capsules mentioned in the note remained unclear. More exotic theories began emerging from Brazil's growing interest in space exploration and UFO phenomena. The 1960s had seen increased public fascination with extraterrestrial life, partly fueled by the space race between the United States and the Soviet Union. Some theorists suggested that Manuel and Miguel had been attempting to make contact with alien visitors, using the lead masks to protect themselves from harmful radiation while awaiting some form of otherworldly signal. This extraterrestrial hypothesis gained traction when investigators discovered that both men had been reading science fiction magazines and had shown interest in reports of unidentified flying objects. Several witnesses in the Vintem Hill area reported seeing strange lights in the sky around the time of the deaths, though these accounts couldn't be verified and might have been influenced by publicity surrounding the case. Electronics engineer Dr. Fernando Lima proposed a more scientific but equally intriguing theory. He suggested the men might have been conducting unauthorized experiments with electromagnetic fields or radio frequency emissions. The lead masks could have been primitive protection against electromagnetic radiation, while their death might have resulted from exposure to dangerous levels of electrical or radio energy generated by homemade equipment. This theory gained some credibility when investigators learned that both victims had been asking colleagues about high-voltage electrical systems and electromagnetic shielding. However, investigators found no experimental equipment at the scene, and neither man had the resources to construct devices capable of generating lethal electromagnetic fields. Religious and occult explanations also emerged, despite the victims' apparent lack of involvement in such practices. Some suggested that the victims had been engaged in spiritual experiments aimed at achieving out-of-body experiences or contact with supernatural entities. The formal language of the note, with its references to specific timing and protective measures, resembled ritual instructions found in certain esoteric traditions. Professor Carlos Andrade, an anthropologist studying Brazilian folk religions, noted similarities between the lead masks case and certain African-derived spiritual practices that had taken root in Brazil. Some traditions involved the use of protective amulets and specific timing for spiritual communications. However, lead masks were not part of any known Brazilian religious practice, and both men's families insisted they had no involvement with such beliefs. Industrial espionage theories suggested the men might have been involved in stealing or selling technical secrets, with their deaths resulting from a deal gone wrong. The cover story of a business trip, the secretive behavior, and their technical expertise all supported this possibility. However, investigators found no evidence of valuable information being stolen from their employers, nor any indication they had been in contact with foreign agents or industrial competitors. Perhaps the most persistent theory involved government conspiracy, suggesting that Manuel and Miguel had stumbled upon classified military experiments or had been eliminated to prevent them from revealing state secrets. Brazil's military government in 1966 was indeed conducting various research projects, and the formal language of the note resembled military communications protocols. However, extensive investigation revealed no government connection to either man, and military officials denied any involvement in activities that might have led to their deaths. The theory persisted largely because of its explanatory power rather than supporting evidence. Each theory offered partial explanations for some aspects of the case, while failing to account for others, leaving the mystery as perplexing as ever. 6 months after the discovery on Vintem Hill, Inspector Pedrosa received an unexpected visitor who would introduce an entirely new dimension to the lead mask's case. Dr. Elena Vasquez, a visiting researcher from the University of São Paulo's physics department, had been following the investigation through newspaper reports, and believed she might offer insights that had been overlooked by conventional criminal investigation. Dr. Vasquez specialized in atmospheric physics and electromagnetic phenomena, fields that were rapidly expanding in the 1960s as scientists began to understand the complex interactions between Earth's magnetic field, solar radiation, and human-made electrical systems. Her interest in the lead mask's case had been piqued by the victim's apparent concern with protecting metals and their use of lead shielding, details that suggested knowledge of electromagnetic principles. Inspector, Dr. Vasquez explained during their first meeting, what if these men weren't protecting themselves from earthly dangers, but from something in the atmosphere itself? She had brought a collection of scientific journals and research papers, which illustrated the growing awareness about electromagnetic hazards in the mid-1960s. The timing of the deaths, she noted, coincided with a period of unusual solar activity. Solar flares and magnetic storms in August 1966 had been significant enough to disrupt radio communications across South America. Amateur radio operators had reported strange interference patterns, and several commercial airlines had experienced navigation difficulties attributed to electromagnetic disturbances. More intriguing was Dr. Vasquez's discovery that both Manuel and Miguel had been corresponding with amateur radio enthusiasts in the months before their deaths. Through careful investigation of radio operator networks, she had uncovered evidence that both men had been asking questions about electromagnetic shielding and the biological effects of radio frequency exposure. The physics professor had also identified what she believed might be the source of the victim's information about electromagnetic dangers. A series of articles published in technical magazines during early 1966 had discussed theoretical risks associated with high-altitude electromagnetic experiments being conducted by various governments. While much of this information was speculative or even sensationalized, it could have influenced technically trained individuals to take protective measures. Consider the lead masks not as protection from aliens or government rays, Dr. Vasquez suggested, but as crude Faraday cages designed to shield their brains from electromagnetic interference. The positioning on a hilltop, away from urban electrical systems, makes sense if they were trying to avoid electromagnetic pollution while exposing themselves to natural atmospheric phenomena. This electromagnetic theory provided new context for the mysterious note. The reference to awaiting a signal could have meant monitoring for specific electromagnetic events, perhaps solar flare activity or atmospheric electrical phenomena that both men believed required protective observation. The timing specified in the note might have corresponded to predicted periods of electromagnetic activity. Dr. Vasquez had researched historical records and discovered that August 20th, 1966, had indeed featured unusual atmospheric electrical activity. Lightning detectors across the Rio region had recorded abnormal patterns, and several amateur meteorologists had noted strange cloud formations that might have indicated electromagnetic disturbances in the upper atmosphere. The capsules mentioned in the note took on new significance under this electromagnetic theory. Dr. Vasquez suggested they might have contained substances believed to protect against radiation exposure, perhaps iodine compounds or other materials that amateur scientists in the 1960s sometimes used as protection against various forms of radiation. Further investigation revealed that both men had been members of amateur science clubs that discussed topics ranging from radio astronomy to atmospheric phenomena. These groups, while not formally organised, exchanged information through correspondence networks that connected technically minded individuals across Brazil. Some members had become convinced that government and military electromagnetic experiments posed health risks to civilian populations. The electromagnetic theory also explained the victims' interest in elevated locations with clear sight lines. If they were attempting to observe or measure atmospheric electromagnetic phenomena, a hilltop position would provide optimal conditions while minimising interference from urban electrical systems. The remote location of Vintém Hill suddenly made sense as a scientific observation point rather than a meeting place for mysterious activities. Dr. Vasquez had even identified similar cases from other countries where amateur scientists had attempted to study electromagnetic phenomena using crude protective equipment. While none had resulted in deaths, several incidents involved individuals taking substantial risks based on incomplete understanding of electromagnetic hazards. However, the electromagnetic theory still couldn't fully explain how both men had died. Even if they had exposed themselves to dangerous electromagnetic fields, the medical evidence didn't clearly support electromagnetic radiation as a cause of death. The absence of burns, cellular damage, or other indicators of electromagnetic exposure remained problematic. Nevertheless, Dr. Vasquez's research had paved the way for further investigation and provided the first scientifically grounded explanation for many previously inexplicable aspects of the case. The lead mask case was beginning to look less like a criminal mystery and more like a scientific tragedy. A startling discovery was made by construction workers building a new radio transmission tower in the area, nearly 2 years after the discovery on Vintém Hill, turning the lead mask's case in an unexpected direction. Buried approximately 50 metres from where the bodies had been found, they uncovered a metal container that had been carefully hidden beneath rocks and soil. The container's contents would provide the most significant breakthrough in the investigation since the initial discovery. Inspector Pedrosa, now nearing retirement but still haunted by the unsolved case, was called to examine the find. The container was a waterproof aluminum box, the type used by amateur radio operators to protect sensitive equipment from moisture and electromagnetic interference. Inside, wrapped in protective plastic, were documents that immediately connected to Manuel and Miguel's final journey. The first document was a detailed, hand-drawn map of the Vintém Hill area, with specific locations marked and numbered. The spot where the bodies were found was clearly indicated, along with several other positions that appeared to represent observation points or equipment placement sites. Compass bearings and distance measurements covered the margins, suggesting careful surveying of the terrain. More revealing were the technical diagrams and calculations that filled several pages. These showed sophisticated understanding of electromagnetic field patterns, antenna design, and atmospheric electrical phenomena. While the handwriting was difficult to identify definitively, the technical knowledge displayed was consistent with both men's professional backgrounds. Perhaps most important was a series of letters between the victims and an individual identified only as Dr. A . These correspondence pieces, dating from early 1966 through just days before the deaths, revealed a relationship with someone who appeared to be coordinating the activities that led to Vintém Hill. Dr. A provided detailed instructions about timing, equipment preparation, and safety procedures that directly corresponded to the mysterious note found with the bodies. The letters revealed that Manuel and Miguel had been recruited for what Dr. A described as an atmospheric electrical monitoring experiment of national importance. They were told that their technical skills made them ideal candidates for collecting data on electromagnetic phenomena that government agencies were allegedly unable to study openly due to international agreements restricting such research. Dr. A's correspondence demonstrated sophisticated knowledge of electromagnetic theory and atmospheric physics. The letters included detailed explanations of how solar activity affected Earth's magnetic field, how these interactions created measurable electromagnetic pulses, and why such measurements required protection from electromagnetic interference, hence the lead masks and elevated observation position. The safety instructions were particularly chilling in retrospect. Dr. A had outlined specific protocols to safeguard against electromagnetic overload during peak atmospheric electrical events. The lead masks were identified as essential protection for the brain, which was supposedly vulnerable to electromagnetic disruption during periods of high atmospheric electrical activity. Most disturbing was a letter dated just 3 days before the deaths, in which Dr. A provided final instructions, including the precise timing and protective measures that appeared in the note found with the bodies. This letter also mentioned observation enhancement compounds that would help the subjects maintain focus during the critical observation period, almost certainly referring to the capsules mentioned in the final note. The buried container also included technical equipment that hadn't been found with the bodies, a sophisticated radio receiver modified for monitoring atmospheric electromagnetic activity, several measuring instruments, and what appeared to be a primitive electromagnetic field detector. This equipment represented a significant investment and suggested the involvement of someone with substantial resources and technical expertise. Inspector Pedrosa immediately began trying to identify Dr. A, but the letters provided few concrete clues about the person's identity or location. The letterhead was generic, the postmarks were smudged or illegible, and the writing style was formal and impersonal. However, the level of technical knowledge suggested someone with advanced education in physics or electrical engineering. Interviews with colleagues and family members of both victims revealed that neither had mentioned working with anyone identified as Dr. A, though both had referred vaguely to consulting work and special projects in the months before their deaths. This implied that they had conducted their relationship with Dr. A in secrecy, possibly under instructions not to discuss the work with others. The discovery of the buried container fundamentally changed the investigation's direction. Rather than focusing on the mysterious circumstances of the deaths themselves, investigators now had evidence of a larger conspiracy involving at least one other individual who had directed the victims' activities. The lead masks case was no longer just about two men who had died mysteriously on a hilltop. It was about someone who had orchestrated their presence there. However, identifying and locating Dr. A would prove to be even more challenging than explaining the original mystery, opening new questions about the true scope and purpose of whatever experiment had cost Manuel and Miguel their lives. 5 decades have passed since Jorge da Costa Alves discovered two men in lead masks on Vintem Hill, yet the case continues to generate interest and controversy among investigators, researchers, and mystery enthusiasts worldwide. Despite extensive investigation, advances in forensic science, and numerous theories proposed by experts in fields ranging from toxicology to electromagnetic physics, the fundamental questions surrounding the deaths of Manuel Pereira de Cruz and Miguel José Viana remain unanswered. The search for the mysterious Dr. A consumed considerable investigative resources throughout the late 1960s and early 1970s. Inspector Pedrosa, working with federal authorities and international police agencies, pursued hundreds of leads without ever definitively identifying the person who had apparently orchestrated the events leading to the deaths. Several individuals with the necessary technical knowledge were investigated, but none could be conclusively linked to the correspondence found in the buried container. One promising lead involved a former university professor who had left Brazil abruptly in late 1966, but efforts to locate him in various South American countries proved unsuccessful. Another investigation focused on a group of amateur scientists who had been conducting unauthorized radio experiments, but their activities, while suspicious, couldn't be directly connected to the Vintem Hill incident. The case attracted international attention, partly because of its unique combination of mystery and scientific intrigue. During the height of the Cold War, when both superpowers were conducting classified research into electromagnetic weapons and atmospheric phenomena, the lead mask's case seemed to offer tantalizing hints about secret experiments that might have gone tragically wrong. UFO researchers jumped on the case as possible proof of contact with aliens, pointing out the use of electromagnetic protection, the isolated location, and the mention of waiting for a signal as signs of trying to reach out to extraterrestrials. While this theory gained popular attention, it couldn't account for the human manipulation evident in Dr. A's correspondence with the victims. Modern analysis of the physical evidence has provided some additional insights while raising new questions. Advanced toxicology techniques have confirmed the presence of several compounds in tissue samples preserved from the original investigation, but their significance remains unclear. Some appear to be naturally occurring substances that could have been consumed as herbal preparations, while others might represent environmental contamination or preservation artifacts. Computer analysis of the electromagnetic data collected by researchers in 1966 has revealed that the timing specified in the victim's note corresponded to a period of unusual electromagnetic activity. However, whether the finding represents coincidence or evidence that Dr. A possessed sophisticated knowledge of atmospheric electrical patterns remains disputed. The lead masks themselves have been subjected to extensive analysis by materials scientists and metallurgists. Their construction demonstrates considerable skill and suggests access to specialized tools and techniques. The lead used appears to have been sourced from industrial suppliers, but efforts to trace its origin have been unsuccessful due to incomplete records from the 1960s. Perhaps most frustrating for investigators has been the complete absence of additional evidence linking to Dr. A, or explaining the broader context of whatever experiment was being conducted. Despite intensive searches of the Vintém Hill area using ground-penetrating radar and metal detection equipment, no additional buried containers or equipment caches have been discovered. The case has influenced popular culture, inspiring numerous books, documentaries, and fictional adaptations. However, media attention has also contributed to the spread of unsubstantiated theories and false information that has complicated serious investigation. Distinguishing between legitimate evidence and sensationalized speculation remains challenging for researchers approaching the case today. From a scientific perspective, the lead masks case represents an intriguing example of how incomplete understanding of electromagnetic phenomena in the 1960s might have led technically trained individuals to take dangerous protective measures. The era's growing awareness of electromagnetic hazards, combined with limited public access to authoritative information, created conditions where well-intentioned but misguided experiments could have tragic consequences. The psychological aspects of the case continue to fascinate researchers studying group dynamics and shared belief systems. The apparent willingness of two rational, technically competent individuals to participate in potentially dangerous activities based on instructions from an unknown correspondent raises questions about persuasion, authority, and the influence of technical expertise on decision-making. Today, the lead masks case stands as one of Brazil's most enduring mysteries, representing the intersection of science, mystery, and human tragedy. While modern investigative techniques and scientific knowledge provide new tools for analysis, the passage of time has also meant the loss of potential witnesses and the degradation of physical evidence. The case serves as a reminder that even in our interconnected, information-rich modern world, it remains possible for individuals to become involved in activities that are never fully understood or explained. Somewhere in the hills outside Rio de Janeiro, the truth about what happened on August 20th, 1966 may still be waiting to be discovered, buried as carefully as the metal container that provided the investigation's most significant breakthrough. The mystery endures as compelling today as it was nearly 60 years ago. Brother Matthias pressed his quill against the parchment, ink pooling like a small wound. The monastery scriptorium felt unusually quiet this July morning, in 1518, as if the very walls held their breath. Outside Strasbourg's timber-framed houses, something unprecedented was unfolding, something that would challenge every assumption about human nature, divine will, and the boundaries between reason and chaos. The woman had begun 3 days prior. Frau Trophea, a baker's wife, whose hands had kneaded thousands of loaves and whose feet had walked the cobblestones in measured steps for 43 years. Yet, on that sweltering Tuesday, those same feet had betrayed every principle of human dignity. They moved without her permission, lifting and stepping, turning and pivoting in patterns that belonged neither to any known dance nor to any recognizable madness. Matthias had witnessed possession before. The monastery served as refuge for those touched by devils, those whose minds had fractured under the weight of worldly concerns. But the dancing differed fundamentally from the thrashing, incoherent movements of the afflicted. Frau Trofea's dance possessed an almost mathematical precision, as if her body followed instructions written in a language only her muscles could read. The crowd that gathered around her grew throughout that first day. Initially, neighbours assumed she celebrated some private joy, perhaps news of a pregnancy after years of barrenness, or word that her husband's debts had been forgiven. But as hours passed without pause, without water or rest, their smiles transformed into frowns of concern, then masks of fear. Dr. Hieronymus Bock, the city's most respected physician, arrived before sunset. His examination revealed no fever, no signs of ergot poisoning from contaminated grain, and no symptoms of St. Vitus's dance. Her pulse remained steady despite the continuous exertion. Although her eyes appeared wild, they tracked movement and responded to sound. Most puzzling of all, when spoken to directly, she could respond coherently, even as her body continued its relentless choreography. "I cannot stop," she gasped between movements that resembled a peasant reel crossed with something far more ancient. "My feet, they know something I do not." By the second day, 3 others had joined her. Hans Burkhardt, a blacksmith, was among them, his powerful frame making his graceful pirouettes seem almost blasphemous. Elisabeth Zimmern, who was barely 16, performed a dance that resembled a courtly pavane. Most disturbing of all was Father Wilhelm, whose ecclesiastical robes billowed as he spun in movements that seemed to mock the very rituals he had performed for 20 years. The city council convened emergency sessions. The medical college debated theories ranging from corrupted humours to celestial malignment. The clergy declared days of prayer and fasting, yet nothing slowed the spreading contagion, which it certainly was. Although it differed from any plague that had ever afflicted Christian lands, Brother Matthias found himself appointed as official recorder, tasked with documenting each new case, each development in what scholars were already calling the most significant mass affliction since the Children's Crusade. His training in both theology and natural philosophy positioned him uniquely to observe without predetermined judgment, and to record without the filter of established doctrine. What he witnessed defied every category of human experience. The dancers, for lack of a better term, showed no signs of coordination, yet moved in patterns that occasionally synchronized. They ate when food was placed in their mouths, but seemed incapable of stopping to seek nourishment independently. Most unsettling, they appeared to find genuine joy in their condition, laughing and singing between bouts of exhaustion that would have felled any normal person. As his quill scratched across the parchment that would become one of history's most important primary sources, Matthias couldn't shake the feeling that he documented not merely an outbreak of collective madness, but something far more profound. The dancers moved as if responding to music only they could hear, as if their bodies had become instruments in some cosmic composition whose meaning remained tantalizingly beyond comprehension. The mystery had only begun to unfold. Within a week, the dancing had claimed 34 souls. Brother Matthias walked the streets each dawn, counting the swaying figures, noting the peculiar evolution of their movements. What had begun as individual expressions of inexplicable compulsion was developing into something resembling choreographed chaos. The city's response revealed the deep fractures in medieval understanding of human nature. Physicians clung to Galenic theories of humoral imbalance, prescribing bloodletting and purges that proved utterly ineffective. The clergy proclaimed the dancing a divine punishment for the city's moral failings, pointing to everything from excessive merchant profits to the popularity of secular music. Yet neither medical intervention nor spiritual remedies showed any impact on the spreading affliction. Most intriguing to Matthias was the pattern of contagion. The dance didn't spread through physical contact or proximity, as plagues typically did. Instead, it seemed to select its victims according to some hidden logic. Agnes Müller, a wealthy merchant's wife known for her charity work, began dancing while distributing bread to the poor, but her servants, who had closer contact with the afflicted, remained unaffected. Meanwhile, Klaus Weber, a solitary cobbler who rarely ventured from his workshop, suddenly appeared in the main square. his leather apron flying as he performed leaps that would have impressed the finest court entertainers. The dancers themselves provided few clues. During their brief moments of rest, never more than an hour and often far less, they spoke of dreams filled with music, of voices calling them to move, of an overwhelming sense that their dancing served some essential purpose they couldn't articulate. Frau Trophea, now entering her second week of continuous movement, claimed she could see patterns in the air itself, geometric shapes that guided her steps. It's not madness, she insisted to Dr. Bock during one of his increasingly frequent examinations. It's remembering. My body remembers something my mind forgot. The physician noted this comment in his records, along with his observation that the dancers showed remarkable physical resilience. Despite consuming minimal food and water, despite dancing through the heat of July days and the cool of summer nights, none showed signs of the exhaustion that should have killed them days ago. Their feet, which should have been bloodied stumps, remained intact. Their hearts, which should have burst from the exertion, beat with steady rhythm. Local authorities faced an impossible situation. The dancing disrupted commerce, frightened visitors, and challenged the social order. Yet the dancers committed no crime beyond the violation of public decorum. They harmed no one, stole nothing, preached no heresy. How do you arrest someone whose only offence is an inability to stand still? The guild masters demanded action. The bakers complained that the dancing crowds frightened customers. The weavers reported decreased productivity as workers abandoned their looms to watch the spectacle. The church worried about declining attendance at services, though ironically many citizens spent more time in prayer, begging God to spare them from joining the dance. Young Elisabeth Zimmer's case particularly troubled Matthias. The girl came from a respectable family, had shown no signs of mental instability, and had been betrothed to a goldsmith's son just weeks before her affliction began. Yet when her parents and fiancé pleaded with her to stop, she could only weep while her body continued its measured movements. "I want to stop," she sobbed. "But the music, can't you hear it? It's so beautiful, and it says I must dance until something happens. Something important." The goldsmith's son, Johann, maintained a vigil beside her, bringing water and food, wiping her tears, even attempting to hold her still through sheer physical force. Nothing worked. Eventually he began moving to her rhythm, swaying slightly as he sat beside her. Matthias watched this development with growing alarm, wondering if Johann might become the next victim. Dr. Bock proposed an experiment. If the dancing represented some form of musical enchantment, perhaps counter-music might provide relief. He hired the city's best musicians to play calming melodies near the dancers, hoping to break whatever spell held them. The result was catastrophic. The moment the first note sounded, every dancer stopped. For 30 heartbeats, silence filled the square. Then, as if responding to some unheard conductor's baton, they began dancing with renewed vigour, their movements now synchronized to the musicians' playing. The music seemed to feed the affliction rather than cure it. That night, 3 musicians joined the dancers. Dr. Hieronymus Bock had studied at the finest universities in Europe. He had treated plague victims in Vienna, examined cases of ergotism in Bavaria, and corresponded with physicians from Paris to Prague. Yet the dancing plague challenged every principle of medical knowledge he had accumulated over 30 years of practice. His detailed observations, preserved in the monastery archives, provide the most systematic analysis of the phenomenon. The dancers showed no fever, no delirium, and no physical abnormalities beyond their compulsive movement. Their pulse rates, while elevated during active dancing, remained within survivable ranges. Most puzzling is that their bodies adapted to the continuous exertion in ways that defied physiological understanding. "The human form is not designed for such prolonged activity," he wrote to his former professor at the University of Basel. Yet these individuals show no signs of the muscle deterioration, dehydration, or cardiac distress that should accompany such exertion. It is as if their bodies have entered some altered state that suspends normal biological limitations. Bock's attempts at treatment revealed the inadequacy of contemporary medical theory. Bloodletting, the universal remedy for humoral imbalance, produced no change in the dancer's condition. Purges and emetics failed to expel whatever poison might have caused the affliction. even trepanation, performed on one willing volunteer, merely added a head wound to his list of ailments without diminishing his need to dance. The physician began to suspect that the dancing plague represented something entirely outside the realm of traditional medicine. His correspondence with Brother Matthias reveals a growing fascination with the metaphysical implications of the outbreak. What if this condition originates not in the body but in some faculty of the soul we do not yet understand, he speculated. The dancers speak consistently of hearing music, of seeing patterns, of following instructions that come from within rather than without. Perhaps we witness not disease but revelation. This theory gained support from an unexpected source. Rabbi Mordecai ben Avraham, Strasbourg's most learned Jewish scholar, approached Bock with references from ancient texts describing similar phenomena. The Talmud mentioned cases of compulsive dancing associated with divine visions. Kabbalistic texts described states of spiritual ecstasy that manifested through involuntary movement. Islamic scholars in nearby territories reported historical accounts of Sufi mystics whose dancing induced transcendent experiences. Perhaps, the rabbi suggested, these people have stumbled into a state of consciousness that mystics spend lifetimes trying to achieve. Bock found this perspective intriguing but problematic. The dancers showed none of the traditional signs of mystical experience. They reported no visions of divine beings, no prophecies, no unusual wisdom or insight. Instead, they seemed trapped in a state that brought neither spiritual enlightenment nor physical relief. The physician's most significant breakthrough came through careful observation of the dancers' interactions with each other. Despite the apparent randomness of their movements, patterns emerged. Dancers who had been strangers before their affliction began to move in complementary rhythms. Their individual dances gradually synchronized, creating complex group choreographies that seemed to serve some unifying purpose. Margaret Lohner, a widow who had joined the dancers in the third week, provided crucial testimony during one of her brief rest periods. "We are pieces of something larger," she gasped. "Each dance is a part, but we cannot see the whole. Only when we all move together does the true pattern emerge." Bock began mapping the dancers' positions and movements, creating diagrams that revealed an underlying geometry to their apparently chaotic activity. The patterns resembled mathematical principles he had encountered in architectural texts. Golden ratios, spiral sequences, harmonic proportions that appeared throughout nature. This discovery led to a disturbing realization. If the dancing followed mathematical laws, it might not be random affliction but rather the manifestation of some deeper order. The dancers might be unconsciously creating a physical representation of abstract principles, their bodies serving as instruments in a vast calculation whose purpose remained hidden. The implications terrified both physician and scholar. If human beings could be compelled to serve as components in some larger system without their conscious awareness, what did this suggest about free will, about the nature of individual identity, about humanity's place in the cosmic order? As July drew to a close with over 60 dancers now active in Strasbourg's streets, Bock abandoned his attempts at medical treatment. Instead, he focused on documentation, convinced that he witnessed not disease but discovery, the unveiling of some fundamental aspect of human nature that had remained hidden until this extraordinary moment. The mystery was deepening rather than resolving, and the implications grew more unsettling with each passing day. The ecclesiastical response to the dancing plague exposed deep theological tensions within the church. Brother Matthias found himself at the centre of heated debates between different factions of clergy, each proposing radically different interpretations of the unprecedented phenomenon. Bishop Johann Weidmann initially declared the dancing a manifestation of demonic possession, ordering exorcisms and public prayers for the afflicted. Yet, when Father Wilhelm, one of the diocese's most respected priests, joined the dancers, this explanation became untenable. How could a man who had spent decades fighting evil suddenly succumb to it? The dancing father continued to recite prayers and bless those who approached him, even as his body swayed in patterns that seemed to mock ecclesiastical dignity. Prior Benedict, head of Matthias's monastery, proposed an alternative theory rooted in mystical tradition. Perhaps God tests our understanding, he suggested during a chapter meeting. Scripture tells us David danced before the Lord with all his might. The prophets often receive divine communication through ecstatic states. What if these dancers had been chosen to receive revelation in a form we do not yet comprehend? An unexpected source of support for this perspective emerged. Sister Johanna of the nearby convent of St. Agnes reported that several nuns had experienced powerful spiritual visions while observing the dancers. During their regular hours of prayer, they found themselves moving in subtle rhythms that seemed to echo the dancers' movements. Most significantly, they reported an enhanced sense of divine presence during these experiences. When I allow my body to respond to the rhythm I perceive in their dancing, Sister Johanna testified, my prayers become more profound, my connection to the Creator more immediate. It is as if their movements create a bridge between earthly and heavenly realms. Yet this mystical interpretation faced strong opposition from the Dominican friars, who saw in the dancing a dangerous form of enthusiasm that threatened church authority. Brother Heinrich, their most vocal spokesman, argued that any spiritual experience not mediated through established religious channels must be viewed with extreme suspicion. These dancers claimed to receive instruction directly from some divine or cosmic source, he declared during a public sermon. They circumvent the sacraments, disregard clerical guidance, and adhere to impulses that might stem from the depths of hell. If we accept their claims, we undermine the very foundation of Christian order. The theological debate intensified when several dancers began incorporating religious gestures into their movements. They crossed themselves while spinning, genuflected during leaps, and raised their arms in positions reminiscent of crucifixion. Yet these sacred elements appeared seamlessly woven into dance patterns that retained their essentially secular character. Matthias observed these developments with growing fascination. The dancers seemed to access some form of religious expression that transcended traditional categories. Their movement prayers appeared simultaneously more primitive and more sophisticated than conventional worship, as if they had discovered a method of spiritual communication that predated organized religion yet pointed towards some more evolved form of divine encounter. The situation became even more complex when Rabbi Mordecai reported similar theological discussions within the Jewish community. Several respected Torah scholars had begun incorporating swaying movements into their study sessions, claiming that physical rhythm enhanced their ability to penetrate sacred texts. The Kabbalistic tradition of meditative movement suddenly seemed directly relevant to current events. Perhaps, the rabbi suggested to Matthias during one of their regular conversations, we witness the emergence of a universal spiritual language that transcends the boundaries between our different faiths. The dancers may be unconsciously recovering ancient forms of worship that were practiced before religious traditions became institutionalized. This possibility alarmed both Christian and Jewish authorities. If the dancing represented some primordial form of spiritual expression, it potentially challenged the legitimacy of all established religious institutions. The dancers' apparent ability to access transcendent experiences without priestly mediation suggested that formal religious structures might be unnecessary, or even obstacles to genuine spiritual encounter. The controversy reached a crescendo when young Elisabeth Zimmern began speaking in what appeared to be unknown languages during her dance. Linguistic scholars determined that her utterances followed consistent grammatical patterns but corresponded to no known human tongue. Church authorities faced the uncomfortable possibility that she spoke in the tongues of angels mentioned in Scripture, yet outside any recognized ecclesiastical context. Bishop Weidmann found himself in an impossible position. He could not condemn phenomena that might represent genuine divine communication, yet he could not endorse activities that undermined church authority. His compromise solution satisfied no one. He declared the dancing neither inherently sacred nor profane, but rather a mysterious manifestation that required careful study before any definitive theological judgment could be made. This official position of studied neutrality reflected the broader uncertainty that gripped all of Strasbourg's intellectual and spiritual leaders. The dancing plague had revealed the inadequacy of every existing framework for understanding human behavior and divine interaction. As July turned to August, with the number of dancers approaching 100, it became clear that the phenomenon would not be easily contained within familiar categories of explanation. The sacred and profane were merging in ways that challenged the very foundations of medieval worldview, and no one could predict where this unprecedented fusion might lead. The Strasbourg City Council faced an administrative nightmare without precedent in municipal law. How do you govern a population increasingly composed of individuals who cannot control their own movements? By early August 1518, nearly 100 citizens danced continuously through the streets, creating chaos that threatened the city's economic and social stability. Magistrate Conrad Wickram, elected to office based on his reputation for practical problem-solving, found every conventional solution ineffective. His first approach had been straightforward law enforcement: arrest the dancers for disturbing the peace. However, the city jail could not accommodate 100 prisoners, especially prisoners who required constant supervision and continued to dance within their cells. Moreover, the legal precedent was unclear. Medieval law addressed theft, assault, heresy, and various forms of misconduct, but nowhere in legal tradition could the magistrates find guidance for dealing with compulsive dancing. The guild masters presented increasingly desperate petitions. The bakers reported significant losses as crowds of spectators made normal business impossible. The cloth merchants complained that trade delegations from other cities were avoiding Strasbourg, fearing contamination by whatever affliction caused the dancing. Most seriously, agricultural workers from surrounding villages were abandoning their harvest duties, drawn to the city by reports of the miraculous dancing. If this continues through harvest season, warned Johann Zeckler, master of the Farmers' Guild, we face not merely economic disruption but potential famine. The dancers consume resources while producing nothing. Worse, they inspire others to abandon productive labour in favour of gawking at this spectacle. Wickram's attempts at practical solutions revealed the phenomenon's resistance to conventional intervention. He hired additional musicians, reasoning that if dancing was inevitable, perhaps organised music might channel it in less disruptive directions. This backfired spectacularly when the musicians themselves became infected and joined the ranks of the uncontrollably dancing. The magistrate then attempted to confine the dancers to a specific area outside the city walls, hoping to minimise their impact on daily commerce. However, the dancers showed no awareness of artificial boundaries. They moved according to internal imperatives that paid no attention to human attempts at crowd control. Guards assigned to maintain containment found themselves gradually swaying to the rhythm of the dancers' movements, requiring frequent rotation to prevent further infections. Legal scholars consulted ancient Roman law, canon law, and traditional Germanic customs, finding no precedent for the current situation. The dancers committed no crime, yet violated social order. They harmed no one yet endangered public welfare. They followed no leader, yet moved with apparent coordination. Every category of legal classification proved inadequate. Dr. Bock's medical reports complicated attempts at legal resolution. His documentation demonstrated that the dancers suffered from no disease that legal authorities could reasonably quarantine. They showed no signs of madness that would justify confinement to asylums. Most problematically, they retained enough mental capacity to make their own decisions about most matters. They simply could not control their compulsive movement. The situation deteriorated when several city council members began showing signs of rhythmic susceptibility. Observers noticed Councilman Peter Imlin swaying during official meetings, his foot tapping in patterns that appeared to mimic the dancers' rhythms. Rather than acknowledge this development, the council implemented new procedures requiring all members to remain seated and still during deliberations, with guards instructed to intervene if anyone showed signs of unusual movement. Economic pressure mounted as trade relationships suffered. Merchants from Basel and Frankfurt reported to their city councils that Strasbourg had become a city possessed, discouraging commercial interaction until the crisis resolved. The annual harvest fair, crucial to the region's economy, faced potential cancellation as participating merchants expressed reluctance to enter a city where they might become infected with uncontrollable dancing. Wickram's most creative solution involved attempting to negotiate directly with the dancers. Perhaps reasoning could succeed where force had failed. He organised formal meetings where city representatives attempted to discuss the situation with dancers during their brief rest periods. These conversations proved profoundly unsettling. The dancers consistently expressed their desire to stop, their awareness of the disruption they caused, and their complete inability to control their condition. Yet they also described their dancing as serving some essential purpose that they could not fully articulate. They spoke of participating in something larger than themselves, of their movements contributing to some vast pattern whose completion remained necessary. "Stop," you say, "but we can't stop any more than you can stop your heart," said Frau Trofea. "This dancing is not our choice. It is our function. When the pattern is complete, we will rest. Until then, we must continue." When pressed to explain what pattern they meant, the dancers could offer only vague descriptions of geometric shapes, musical harmonies, and mathematical relationships that their bodies somehow expressed through movement. Their testimony suggested they served as unwilling participants in some cosmic calculation whose nature remained beyond human comprehension. The Council's final attempt at resolution involved consulting authorities from other cities that had experienced similar phenomena. Historical research uncovered scattered reports of dancing outbreaks across European history, yet no detailed documentation was available to offer valuable guidance. Moreover, previous episodes had apparently resolved spontaneously, offering little insight into effective intervention strategies. By late August, Magistrate Wickham privately admitted defeat. The city government could neither stop the dancing nor effectively manage its consequences. They could only hope the phenomenon would end as mysteriously as it began, leaving them to deal with the aftermath. The authorities' inability to address the crisis reflected a deeper failure of medieval institutions to comprehend emerging realities that transcended traditional categories of understanding. September brought an unexpected development that changed everything Brother Matthias thought he understood about the dancing plague. The revelation came not through scholarly analysis or medical examination, but through the observations of an unlikely witness, Master Johann Gutenberg, a visiting printer investigating Strasbourg's potential as a location for his revolutionary, movable type workshop. Gutenberg possessed a unique perspective, shaped by his work with mechanical systems, mathematical precision, and pattern recognition essential to printing technology. While other observers focused on individual dancers or small groups, he studied the overall configuration of all dancers throughout the city. His trained eye, accustomed to detecting subtle alignments and spacing relationships, perceived something that had eluded everyone else. "They are not dancing randomly," he told Matthias during an evening meeting at the monastery. "From an elevated position, I observed from the cathedral tower, their movements create a vast geometric pattern that spans the entire city. Individual dancers serve as moving points in a complex diagram that appears to be nearing completion." Matthias initially dismissed this theory as fanciful speculation. However, Gutenberg's systematic documentation proved compelling. He had mapped the positions of all known dancers at regular intervals, creating a series of diagrams that revealed an underlying order to their apparently chaotic activity. The patterns resembled nothing in conventional human experience. They incorporated elements of sacred geometry, musical harmony, and mathematical principles that seemed almost too sophisticated for the medieval understanding. Yet the evidence was undeniable. The dancers were unconsciously creating a physical representation of abstract concepts that challenged the boundaries of contemporary knowledge. "Look at these measurements," Gutenberg explained, spreading his carefully drafted diagrams across the monastery table. The distances between dancers, the timing of their movements, the directions of their travel, everything follows precise mathematical relationships. They are drawing something in space and time, using their bodies as instruments in a calculation beyond human design. This discovery raised terrifying questions. If the dancers unconsciously followed mathematical laws, who or what had programmed these laws? The patterns were too complex, too purposeful to be accidental, yet they were also too alien to be products of human intelligence. The dancers themselves remained unaware of the larger design they were creating, responding to impulses they could not explain or control. Brother Matthias pondered the implications during sleepless nights. Were the dancers unwilling participants in some cosmic experiment? Had some intelligence, divine, demonic, or entirely other, selected Strasbourg as the site for a demonstration whose purpose remained hidden? The possibility that human beings could be manipulated like pieces on a chessboard challenged fundamental beliefs about free will and human dignity. Dr. Bock's medical observations supported Gutenberg's geometric analysis. The physician had noted that individual dancers' movements became increasingly precise over time, as if they were gradually learning to perform their roles more accurately. Their apparent fatigue seemed to diminish rather than increase, suggesting that their bodies were adapting to serve the requirements of the larger pattern. They are becoming more efficient, Bock reported. Their movements consume less energy while achieving greater precision. It is as if some process is optimizing their performance to serve functions we do not yet understand. The most unsettling aspect of Gutenberg's discovery was its progressive nature. The pattern was not static, but evolving, approaching some form of completion that might trigger unknown consequences. Based on the rate of change he had documented, the printer estimated that the geometric design would reach its final configuration within days. What happens when the pattern is complete? Matthias asked, though he feared the answer. Gutenberg could only speculate. Perhaps the dancers would finally be released from their compulsion. Perhaps the completion would trigger some larger event that the dancing had been designed to facilitate. Or perhaps the entire phenomenon would simply end, leaving behind only the memory of humanity's brief role as unwilling participants in some incomprehensible cosmic process. The printer's analysis also revealed why certain individuals were selected to become dancers, while others remained unaffected. The pattern required specific positions to be filled by dancers with particular physical characteristics, movement capabilities, and spatial relationships to other participants. The selection process had nothing to do with spiritual worthiness, moral character, or personal vulnerability. It was purely functional, based on requirements that remained hidden from human understanding. This mechanical view of the dancing plague stripped away all romantic or mystical interpretations. The dancers were not blessed visionaries or cursed victims. They were simply tools being used by some intelligence to create something beyond human comprehension. Their suffering, their loss of autonomy, their disruption of normal life served as acceptable costs in pursuing some larger objective. As September progressed, Gutenberg's predictions proved accurate. The dancers' movements became increasingly synchronized, their individual variations gradually harmonizing into a unified whole. The geometric pattern approached completion with mathematical inevitability, regardless of human attempts to understand or intervene. The residents of Strasbourg could only wait and wonder what would happen when the mysterious calculation finally reached its conclusion. The pattern that had claimed so many of their neighbours was nearly complete, and none could predict whether its fulfilment would bring liberation or catastrophe. October 15th, 1518. Brother Matthias recorded the date with a trembling hand, knowing he documented either the end of the most mysterious chapter in Strasbourg's history, or merely its transformation into something even more incomprehensible. The dancing plague, which had held the city captive for over 3 months, reached its conclusion in a manner that satisfied no theory and answered no questions. The end came with mathematical precision that confirmed Gutenberg's geometric analysis, while revealing its ultimate inadequacy. At exactly noon, when the cathedral bells announced the 6th hour, every dancer throughout the city stopped simultaneously. The dancers stopped not gradually, not individually, but in perfect unison, as if some cosmic conductor had finally lowered his baton. The silence that followed was more disturbing than the months of continuous movement had been. 137 people stood motionless in streets, squares, and courtyards throughout Strasbourg, their faces bearing expressions of profound confusion and loss. They looked around like dreamers awakening in unfamiliar surroundings, unable to reconcile their present situation with their last clear memories. Dr. Bock rushed to examine the former dancers, expecting to find signs of exhaustion, malnutrition, or physical damage from their prolonged ordeal. Instead, he discovered individuals in remarkably good health. Better health, in many cases, than they had enjoyed before their dancing began. Chronic ailments had disappeared, old injuries had healed, even elderly dancers showed renewed vitality that seemed to reverse months or years of aging. It is as if the dancing purified their bodies while enslaving their wills, Bock reported to the emergency council session convened that afternoon. They have been transformed by their experience in ways that challenge every principle of natural philosophy. Yet the physical improvements came with a price that became apparent only gradually. The former dancers retained no detailed memories of their time in the grip of the compulsion. They remembered beginning to dance, and they remembered the moment of release, but the months between remained largely blank, as if their consciousness had been suspended while their bodies served purposes beyond their understanding. Worrisomely, they reported enduring sensations, implying that their experience had not fully concluded. They felt perpetual awareness of subtle rhythms, faint melodies that seemed to emanate from the air itself. Some claimed they could still perceive the geometric patterns that had guided their movements, now visible as translucent overlays on the normal world. "The dancing has ended," Frau Troffea told Matthias during her first coherent interview, "but something remains. I feel expectant, as if we completed only the first movement of a longer composition." Elisabeth Simmons' testimony proved particularly unsettling. The young woman, whose graceful movements had captivated observers throughout the crisis, now possessed enhanced sensitivity to patterns and relationships that others could not perceive. She could predict weather changes days in advance, sense emotional states in people she had never met, and identify mathematical relationships in natural phenomena with uncanny accuracy. "The dancing taught us something," she explained, "not in words or thoughts, but in our bones, our blood, our deepest being. We learned a language that has no sounds, only movement and relationship and truth." Gutenberg's geometric analysis provided the only framework for understanding what had occurred. His final diagrams showed that the pattern created by the dancers' movements had indeed reached completion on October 15th. Yet completion had not resulted in dissolution, but rather in transformation. The physical dancing had ended, but it had apparently established something permanent, a new configuration of relationships that continued to influence the former dancers and, increasingly, the city itself. Over the following weeks, Strasbourg experienced subtle but significant changes. Trade negotiations proceeded more smoothly, as if commercial relationships had been somehow optimized. Conflicts between guildmasters resolved more easily. Even the weather seemed more favorable, with gentle rains arriving precisely when crops required moisture. Citizens began reporting unusually vivid dreams, enhanced creativity, and improved ability to understand complex problems. It was as if the completed geometric pattern had created some form of beneficial resonance that enhanced human capabilities throughout the region. Yet these improvements carried an undercurrent of unease. If unknown intelligences could manipulate human beings to create patterns that then influenced entire communities, what did such behavior suggest about human autonomy? Were the residents of Strasbourg now subject to guidance they could neither perceive nor resist? Brother Matthias completed his chronicle with more questions than answers. The dancing plague had ended, but its resolution raised more disturbing possibilities than its occurrence had. The dancers had been released from their compulsion, but they remained connected to whatever intelligence had choreographed their movements. The transformation of Strasbourg was complete, yet its nature and purpose remained a mystery. Most troubling of all, reports began arriving from other cities throughout the German states, describing unusual group behaviors, synchronized activities, and collective movements that seemed to echo Strasbourg's experience. Perhaps the dancing plague had not ended, but merely completed its initial phase, preparing for expansion into something far more comprehensive. As winter approached, Matthias sealed his manuscript in the monastery archives, hoping that future scholars might possess the knowledge necessary to understand what he had witnessed. The mystery of the dancing plague would endure long beyond the lives of those who experienced it, a testament to humanity's encounter with forces that operated according to laws not yet discovered and purposes not yet revealed. The dance had ended, but the music played on, silent, invisible, and eternally transformative.
afternoon of November 24th, 1971, a mystery man in a black suit, dark sunglasses, and a thin black tie walked into Portland International Airport and approached the ticket counter for Northwest Orient Airlines. He was calm, quiet, and unremarkable, blending in with the pre-holiday travelers heading home for Thanksgiving. He bought a one-way ticket for $20 in cash, no ID required, under the name Dan Cooper, and boarded Flight 305, a short 30-minute flight bound for Seattle. The aircraft, a Boeing 727, was moderately full, carrying 36 passengers and 6 crew members. To the airline staff, Cooper appeared to be just another businessman, perhaps a corporate executive or a traveling salesman. But as the flight took off at 2:50 p.m., he sat in seat 18C, close to the rear of the plane, holding a black briefcase that contained a terrifying secret. Shortly after takeoff, Cooper did something that would change aviation history forever. He leaned toward a flight attendant, Florence Schaffner, and handed her a small slip of paper. Used to being handed phone numbers from male passengers, she casually tucked the note into her pocket without reading it. But Cooper leaned in again and whispered, "Miss, you better read that note. I have a bomb." Schaffner's face went pale as she unfolded the paper, which contained a simple but chilling message. "I have a bomb in my briefcase. I want $200,000 in cash, 4 parachutes, and a fuel truck standing by in Seattle. No funny business, or I'll do what I have to." Cooper then calmly opened his briefcase, revealing a bundle of red cylinders connected by wires, enough to convince her that he wasn't bluffing. Schaffner, keeping her composure, nodded silently and walked toward the cockpit to inform Captain William Scott of the hijacker's demands. Inside the plane, passengers remained unaware of the unfolding nightmare. The crew, trained for emergencies, followed protocol, relaying the hijacker's demands to air traffic control. Back on the ground, law enforcement scrambled to coordinate a response. The FBI, Seattle Police, and Northwest Orient executives debated whether to comply with the demands or attempt a risky maneuver to subdue the hijacker. But Cooper had been careful in his wording. He had asked for 4 parachutes, not 1. This suggested that he might be forcing a hostage to jump with him, making any attempt to give him a sabotage parachute too dangerous. The authorities had no choice but to comply. Meanwhile, back on Flight 305, Cooper remained unshaken and polite. He lit a cigarette, ordered a bourbon and soda, and sat back as if he were on a normal business trip. When flight attendant Tina Mucklow sat beside him, he spoke softly and respectfully, even offering to pay for his drink. He was not nervous, not erratic, and not rushed. He was completely in control. When Mucklow later described him, she would say that he wasn't cruel or aggressive, but instead thoughtful, intelligent, and oddly kind. For nearly 2 hours, the plane circled Puget Sound, giving authorities enough time to gather the ransom money and prepare the parachutes. At 5:39 p.m., Flight 305 finally landed at Seattle-Tacoma International Airport. Outside, a bright red fuel truck waited near the tarmac, along with dozens of FBI agents hiding in unmarked vehicles, watching the plane's every move. Cooper, careful and calculated, refused to let the crew open the doors until he was sure that the ransom and parachutes had been delivered exactly as he had requested. Finally, an airline official approached the aircraft, carrying a duffel bag filled with 10,000 $20 bills, each one carefully photographed and recorded by the FBI. They also delivered 2 front parachutes and 2 reserve chutes as requested. Once Cooper was satisfied, he released all 36 passengers, keeping only the pilot, co-pilot, flight engineer, and Tina Mucklow on board. The relieved passengers hurried down the stairs to safety, unaware that the most daring part of the hijacking was yet to come. Now alone with the crew, Cooper's next instructions shocked everyone. He demanded that the plane take off again, this time with the rear staircase unlocked and lowered mid-flight. He told the pilots to fly low and slow, heading toward Mexico City at a strict 10,000-foot altitude, with the landing gear stuck down to reduce speed. The crew protested, explaining that such a flight plan was extremely dangerous, but Cooper remained calm and firm. At 7:40 p.m., under the cover of night, Flight 305 took off once more, heading south toward Reno, Nevada, as a refueling stop before Mexico. The crew, forced to stay in the cockpit, could only wait and wonder, what was Cooper planning next? Less than an hour later, somewhere over the dense forests of southwestern Washington, D.B. Cooper vanished into the night, taking $200,000 and his secrets with him. As Flight 305 soared into the black night sky, the stakes had never been higher. The passengers were safe, but the mystery hijacker, now alone with the flight crew, was far from finished. He had everything he needed: $200,000 in small bills, 4 parachutes, and a fully fueled Boeing 727 at his command. But what he did next would cement his name as one of the most legendary criminals in history. As the plane climbed to 10,000 feet, Cooper ordered flight attendant Tina Mucklow to stay in the cockpit with the rest of the crew. His voice was calm but firm, and he made it clear no one was to exit the cockpit under any circumstances. Before locking the door behind her, Mucklow caught a glimpse of Cooper as he knelt in the dimly lit cabin, methodically strapping the ransom money to his body and inspecting the parachutes. It was the last time anyone would ever see him. With the cockpit door sealed shut, the crew had no way of knowing what was happening behind them. But at 8:00 p.m., a warning light flashed in the control panel. Cooper had lowered the rear air stair mid-flight. This feature of the Boeing 727 was unusual. It allowed the plane to be boarded from the rear while on the ground, but it had never been used mid-air before. Cooper had clearly done his homework. The pilots immediately radioed Cooper, asking if he needed help. His response was short and final: no. Then, silence. For several tense minutes, nothing happened. The only sound was the roar of the wind whipping through the open staircase. The pilots maintained their course, flying at a steady 200 miles per hour, holding their altitude at 10,000 feet, exactly as Cooper had demanded. Then, at 8:13 p.m., the entire aircraft lurched violently, as if it had suddenly lost a great deal of weight. The plane tilted upward for a brief moment, forcing the pilots to counteract the sudden shift in balance. The crew immediately suspected what had happened. D.B. Cooper had jumped. Somewhere over the dense wilderness of southwestern Washington, in the middle of a raging storm, a man in a business suit and sunglasses leaped into complete darkness, carrying a bulky bag filled with $200,000 strapped to his body. The night sky was pitch black, the ground miles below, the wind howling at near freezing temperatures. And yet, Cooper had vanished without hesitation. For the next 5 minutes, the flight crew anxiously awaited a follow-up transmission from Cooper, hoping that maybe, just maybe, he had changed his mind and was still on board. But as the minutes passed, it became clear. He was gone. At 10:15 p.m., nearly 2 hours after Cooper had vanished, Flight 305 safely landed at Reno Tahoe International Airport. FBI agents and law enforcement stormed the plane, searching every inch of the cabin, the cargo hold, and even the mechanical compartments. But there was no trace of Cooper. All that remained were 2 of the 4 parachutes, a black tie, and a handful of cigarette butts. The man who had held an entire aircraft hostage extorted $200,000 and pulled off a daring mid-air escape had seemingly disappeared into thin air. But the real mystery was only just beginning. The moment Flight 305 touched down in Reno, the FBI's massive investigation was already in motion. Agents swarmed the plane, searching every inch of the cabin, cargo hold, and landing gear. But as expected, D.B. Cooper was gone. What he left behind was frustratingly little. A black clip-on tie, an empty tie clasp, 8 Raleigh cigarette butts, and 2 of the 4 parachutes, one of which had been cut open, likely to secure the ransom money to his body. The FBI immediately launched one of the largest manhunts in US history, codenamed Norjack, Northwest Hijacking. The first priority was determining where Cooper had landed. With no exact coordinates, investigators turned to the pilots, who recalled feeling the plane lurch at exactly 8:13 p.m., the moment Cooper likely jumped into the stormy night. Using flight path data, wind speed calculations, and reports from military radar stations, authorities estimated that Cooper had landed somewhere in the dense forests of southwestern Washington, near the Lewis River and Mount St. Helens. By daybreak, search teams, including FBI agents, state troopers, local police, and even military personnel, began combing through the rugged terrain, hoping to find a parachute, footprints, money, or even a body. Helicopters hovered over the tree line. Boats patrolled the Columbia River, and bloodhounds were deployed to sniff for any human scent. But the conditions were brutal. Freezing temperatures, heavy rain, and miles of uninhabited wilderness made the search incredibly difficult. Despite weeks of intense efforts, they found nothing. Meanwhile, FBI agents focused on another critical angle. Who was D.B. Cooper? Since he had paid for his ticket in cash and given a fake name, Dan Cooper, they had very little to go on. They interviewed all 36 passengers, the flight crew, and airport staff. But Cooper had been so unremarkable that few people remembered much about him. The best description came from flight attendant Tina Mucklow, who had spent the most time with him. Height, around 5'10 to 6'0". Weight, approximately 170 to 180 pounds. Age, between mid-40s to early 50s. Appearance, Caucasian. Dark hair, with some graying at the temples. Brown eyes, no noticeable scars or tattoos. Clothing, black suit, white shirt, black tie, loafers, sunglasses. Despite this detailed description, there were no immediate matches. The FBI checked known criminals, military records, and missing persons databases, but no one fit the exact profile. As investigators scrambled for leads, the media latched onto the story, turning D.B. Cooper into a folk legend overnight. In an early miscommunication, a journalist mistakenly reported his name as D.B. Cooper instead of Dan Cooper, and the name stuck forever. For months, the FBI pursued every possible lead. Tips flooded in from across the country, with people claiming to have seen Cooper in bars, motels, and small towns. Dozens of men resembling his description were investigated. Some even voluntarily came forward to prove their innocence. But nothing concrete ever surfaced. By the spring of 1972, Nearly 6 months after the hijacking, the investigation hit a dead end. No parachute, no body, no ransom money. The FBI was left with only questions. Did Cooper survive the jump, or did he die in the wilderness? If he survived, where did he go? Why hadn't the money been spent or surfaced anywhere? With no solid answers, the greatest manhunt in US history had come up empty. But then, nearly a decade later, the case took a shocking turn. In 1980, a young boy named Brian Ingram, vacationing with his family near Tenaba on the Columbia River, stumbled upon 3 decayed bundles of cash buried in the sand. When investigators examined the rotting $20 bills, they were stunned. The serial numbers matched Cooper's ransom money. For the first time in 9 years, the world had a tangible clue. But instead of solving the mystery, it only made things more confusing. How did the money end up buried miles from the FBI's predicted landing zone? Did Cooper survive the jump but lose part of his ransom? Or had someone else found it and hidden it there? The discovery reignited the case, and the FBI resumed its search with new urgency. But despite more excavations, more forensic testing, and more theories, no further money was ever found, and Cooper's fate remained a chilling mystery. The greatest criminal escape in aviation history had seemingly been pulled off flawlessly, and D.B. Cooper was still nowhere to be found. As years turned into decades, the hunt for D.B. Cooper became more than just a criminal investigation. It became an obsession. The FBI, private investigators, journalists, and amateur sleuths all tried to piece together the identity of the man who had pulled off the most daring heist in aviation history. Since no body, parachute, or majority of the ransom money was ever found, theories about what really happened to Cooper ran wild. Some believed he had died in the jump, his remains lost in the rugged wilderness of Washington. Others insisted that he had survived and was living under a new identity, spending his stolen fortune in secrecy. But without concrete answers, one question remained at the center of it all. Who was D.B. Cooper? Over the years, law enforcement and independent researchers investigated dozens of potential suspects. Some were compelling, some were outrageous, but none could be definitively proven to be the elusive hijacker, Robert Rackstraw. The ex-military conman, one of the most famous suspects, was Robert Rackstraw, a former army paratrooper and explosives expert with a history of fraud and deception. Rackstraw had the perfect skill set to be Cooper. He knew how to jump from planes, he had survival training, and he had a criminal background. Investigators found that Rackstraw had lied about his military records, used multiple fake identities, and had even faked his own death at one point. When questioned about being Cooper, he never outright denied it. Instead, he would smirk and say things like, "I could be." In the early 2000s, independent researchers studying letters allegedly sent by Cooper after the hijacking claimed they had uncovered coded messages hidden within the text, and those messages allegedly pointed directly to Rackstraw. However, the FBI never found hard evidence tying him to the case, and he always maintained that he was not Cooper. Rackstraw died in 2018, taking whatever secrets he had to the grave. 2. Dwayne Webber, the deathbed confession. In 1995, a man named Dwayne Webber made a shocking statement to his wife just before he died. As he lay on his deathbed, he pulled her close and whispered, "I am Dan Cooper." His wife, puzzled by the confession, began researching the case and realized that her husband had never explained parts of his past. He had scars on his body that suggested he had parachuted before. He he had once joked about leaving fingerprints on a hijacked plane, and, most chillingly, he had taken a solo trip to the Columbia River in 1979, just 1 year before the ransom money was found buried there. After his death, his wife reached out to the FBI, hoping they would compare his fingerprints or DNA with the evidence found on the plane. However, the FBI never found a match. To this day, some still believe Dwayne Webber was the real D.B. Cooper, but there's no proof to confirm it. 3. Kenny Christiansen. The Northwest Orient insider Kenny Christiansen was a flight attendant for Northwest Orient Airlines, the same airline Cooper hijacked. He was an ex-paratrooper, had a background in aviation, and, after the hijacking, he suddenly came into a lot of money. A former colleague claimed that, on his deathbed, Christiansen tried to confess to something, but his words were cut off before he could finish. After his death, his family found large stacks of cash hidden in his home, but none of it matched the marked bills from Cooper's ransom. Despite the suspicious circumstances, the FBI never considered him a prime suspect, believing he did not match the hijacker's description. 4. William J. Smith. The airline revenge theory. Another intriguing theory suggests that D.B. Cooper was actually an airline insider seeking revenge on Northwest Orient Airlines. William J. Smith, a former employee of the railroad industry, had extensive knowledge of airline procedures, and some theorists claimed that the name Dan Cooper could be traced back to an old railway work badge that he used in the 1960s. Smith had been through financial hardships, and some believed he orchestrated the hijacking as payback. While this theory gained traction in later years, there was never any hard evidence connecting Smith to the crime. 5. The Cooper died in the jump theory, one of the oldest theories, and the one that the FBI leaned toward for years, was that D.B. Cooper never survived the jump. This theory argues that the stormy weather and high winds would have made a nighttime parachute landing extremely dangerous even for an expert. Cooper jumped wearing loafers and a business suit, which were terrible choices for surviving in the wilderness. He left behind the most reliable parachute, instead choosing a military-grade reserve chute that had no steering capabilities. No confirmed evidence of his survival, like bank transactions with the ransom money, has ever surfaced. If Cooper didn't survive, his body and the money should have been found, but they weren't. Did he land in a river and get washed away? Did animals scatter his remains? Or did he actually manage to walk out of the woods and disappear? The FBI's final verdict, after 45 years, the FBI officially closed the case in 2016, admitting they had exhausted every lead and were no closer to solving the mystery than they had been in 1971. While dozens of suspects had been investigated, there was no definitive proof linking anyone to the hijacking. The only hard evidence, the tie left behind on the plane, contained DNA, but it was too degraded to provide a match. To this day, D.B. Cooper remains unidentified, and no one knows if he survived. But if he did, he would be in his 90s today, potentially living out his final years as the only man to ever pull off a plane hijacking and get away with it. And perhaps the most chilling thought of all, he could still be out there, watching the world debate his legend. For nearly a decade, the FBI searched for any trace of D.B. Cooper, his parachute, his body, or the ransom money. But year after year, the search came up empty. With no credible sightings, no bank activity, and no physical remains, it seemed as if Cooper had vanished into thin air. But then, in 1980, a discovery changed everything. and raised even more questions. The Tenor Bar money discovery. On February the 10th, 1980, an 8-year-old boy named Brian Ingram was vacationing with his family near Tenor Bar, a sandy riverbank along the Columbia River in Washington, about 20 miles west of where Cooper had supposedly jumped. As he dug into the sand, Brian's hand struck something unusual, a stack of decayed rubber-banded $20 bills. At first, his parents assumed they were old play money or trash, but when they took a closer look, their heart stopped. The bills were real US currency, waterlogged and disintegrating with age. When the FBI analyzed the money, they made a shocking confirmation. The serial numbers matched the D.B. Cooper ransom money. In total, Brian had uncovered 3 bundles of cash, amounting to $5,800. The bills were charred, crumbling, and stained from years in the elements, but their origin was undeniable. For the first time since the hijacking, a piece of Cooper's loot had resurfaced, but instead of solving the mystery, it only deepened it. Theories about the buried money. The discovery of the Tenor Bar money led to endless speculation about how it got there. Did Cooper bury the money? Some believe Cooper himself buried the cash, either as a backup stash or as a decoy to throw off investigators. But if that was the case, why was only a small portion found? And why so far away from the predicted drop zone? Did the money wash downriver? Another theory suggests that the money fell into the Columbia River after Cooper died during his jump. Water could have carried the bills downstream, where they eventually became buried in the sand. However, hydrologists and forensic experts struggled to explain how the bills ended up in a single neat location, instead of being scattered along the riverbanks. Did someone else find the money first? A chilling theory suggests that someone else stumbled upon Cooper's remains, took most of the cash, and buried the leftover bundles at Tenor Bar. This theory raises an even darker question. Was Cooper already dead when his money was discovered? Despite extensive digging and sonar scans, no additional bills were ever found. To this day, the Tenor Bar discovery remains the only piece of Cooper's ransom ever recovered. Other strange clues. Over the years, more bizarre pieces of evidence surfaced, each one adding to the mystery. The rotating parachute theory. In 2008, a group of amateur investigators claimed to have found Cooper's parachute buried in Washington farmland. But when experts examined it, they determined it was not the same model issued to Cooper in 1971. If Cooper did land safely, where was his real parachute? The titanium particles on Cooper's tie. In 2017, forensic scientists re-examined the black tie Cooper left behind on the plane. Using advanced scanning technology, they discovered titanium particles embedded in the fabric, a metal used in jet manufacturing and high-tech engineering. This led some to theorize that Cooper may have worked in the aerospace industry, giving him insider knowledge on how to pull off the perfect airborne escape. The letter to the Washington Post. Shortly after the hijacking, a mysterious letter was sent to the Washington Post, claiming to be from D.B. Cooper himself. The letter read, "I knew from the start I wouldn't be caught. I didn't leave fingerprints behind because I wore a toupee. I had no real identity. I am not a modern-day Robin Hood, but I had to do it." Handwriting experts determined the note was consistent with other anonymous letters sent after the hijacking, but no definitive connection to Cooper was ever made. The missing ransom money. Of the $200,000 of ransom, only the $5,800 found at Tenor Bar has ever been recovered. None of the remaining 9,710 bills have ever turned up in circulation. A baffling fact that suggests Cooper never spent the money or possibly hid it somewhere unrecovered. The FBI's final conclusion. After more than 45 years of searching, the FBI officially closed the D.B. Cooper case in 2016, stating that they had exhausted all possible leads. The case had become one of the longest-running unsolved crimes in U.S. history, and despite advances in DNA technology, forensic science, and aerial search techniques, the mystery of what really happened to Cooper remained as elusive as ever. Was he buried somewhere in the Washington wilderness? Did he live out the rest of his life in secrecy? Or did he stash his money away for decades, waiting for the world to forget about him? One thing was certain. D.B. Cooper had pulled off the impossible. And if he was still alive, he was watching his legend grow. Even after the FBI officially closed the case in 2016, the story of D.B. Cooper never died. If anything, his mysterious disappearance only fueled his mythical status, turning him into one of the greatest unsolved mysteries in American history. His audacity, precision, and sheer defiance of the law captivated generations of investigators, conspiracy theorists, and everyday thrill seekers. He had done what no one else had before, or since, successfully hijacked a plane, stolen $200,000, and vanished into the night without a trace. As time passed, Cooper's legend evolved beyond just a criminal case. He became a symbol of rebellion, adventure, and the ultimate unsolved puzzle. Unlike most criminals, who are feared and reviled, Cooper was seen by many as a modern-day outlaw, a mysterious anti-hero who had outwitted the system and disappeared into history. Cooper in pop culture. Over the years, books, movies, TV shows, and songs have kept Cooper's story alive, each adding their own twist to the mystery. Films and TV, shows like Prison Break, The Blacklist, and Breaking Bad referenced Cooper's infamous escape. The film Without a Paddle, 2004, humorously imagines that Cooper survived and hid in the woods for decades. Books and documentaries. Dozens of books have been written about the case, with titles like Skyjack, The Hunt for D.B. Cooper and the Last Master Outlaw, diving deep into theories, suspects, and forensic evidence. Music and art. The case has inspired songs, paintings, and even tattoos, proving that Cooper's story has morphed into something larger than life. In 2011, a CooperCon, a convention dedicated to solving the mystery, was launched, where investigators, historians, and amateur sleuths gather annually to discuss new theories, re-examine evidence, and debate who Cooper really was. Theories that refuse to die. Despite the case being officially closed, theories about Cooper's identity and fate continue to circulate the internet, crime forums, and investigative circles. He survived and started a new life. Some believe Cooper escaped successfully, possibly with an inside connection that helped him disappear. He died in the jump. Others insist he miscalculated his landing, drowned in a river, or perished in the wilderness. He was a military or CIA operative. Theories suggest he had special training, explaining how he executed the perfect escape. The government covered up his fate. Some speculate that the FBI knows the truth, but has chosen to bury it. The lasting mystery decades later. No one has ever come forward claiming to be Cooper. None of the remaining ransom money has ever surfaced. His true identity remains unknown. The FBI itself once admitted that D.B. Cooper may have been the only hijacker in history who actually got away with it. Unlike other skyjackers who were either caught or killed, Cooper seemed to have planned every detail perfectly. right down to his legendary disappearance. And that is what makes his story so powerful. He is not just a criminal, he is a ghost. A man who defied the odds, vanished without a trace, and left behind a mystery that will likely never be solved. Even today, somewhere out there, a man could be sitting by a fire, watching the world debate his story, knowing that his legend is still as strong as ever. And maybe, just maybe, he's smiling.